And my name is Janae Padmore, and my colleague is Brandon McCord. He has lived in Johannesburg for, in the past, for 2 years, correct, Brandon?
Yeah. Yes, yes.
And we are urban planning and um, health in, sorry, and health
Public
policy,
health.
public
Yeah.
health graduate students, and there's some PhD students amongst us. And we are interested in international development on various levels, and are having an opportunity to interview you today. So we appreciate you coming out and giving us your time. So we'll go right into it. So we're going to start with a little bit about your background. So can you tell us about your educational and career background as a Black South African, and what was the environment like that you grew up in? And did this inspire you to work in town planning and specifically urbanization?
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's when we start. So that's going back, like really way back. I grew up in the Transkei, which is a former homeland.
Cool.
And I don't know if you know the history of homelands, but essentially they were part of the decentralization strategy. So they created the states where certain national tribes, I guess, had freedom. So I'm Xhosa, so I come from the kind of Eastern Cape. And that was one of the six, there were, I think, six TBVC, one of the four homelands. So it was in rural South Africa, but I grew up in the capital city in Umtata, so Mandela's people. And I got into town planning by sheer fluke, like total fluke. So firstly, my next door neighbors were town planning practice. So I kind of grew up knowing of the concept of planning. But I got into town planning at Tech because I couldn't get into my preferred course of study, which I think it was something in the health sciences. And it was a new program at the time, so they were quite keen to take on students. And that's really how I got into planning. So my qualifications, I've got a national higher diploma in planning. I've got a bachelor's of technology, a BTech in planning. And I've got a few kind of executive program qualifications, and I'm busy with my master's in cities with LSE.
Very good. So since we know you're not in town planning with Johannesburg right now, what are you doing currently?
I'm consulting. So I've got my own consulting practice. I still do a bit of work in town planning or urban planning.
Okay.
But my particular area of interest is city governance. So I work with a few cities on kind of understanding city governance, particularly from a built environment perspective, but also linking the built environment stuff with financing, with city finances. Okay. And then I do a bit of work with real estate developers, so private developers.
Okay. We have a commercial realtor amongst us, so she would. I'm pretty sure she would really be interested in hearing a lot more about that.
Okay.
So can you describe your rise into urbanization? And your background statement has told us that you are working to ensuring sustained and shared growth and development. And could you also expand on that a little bit more and how it refers to sustainable development, and specifically, have you been part of any sustainability projects?
Sure. So my interest in cities, firstly, is obviously driven by the rate of urbanization, more so I think in African cities, and Joburg is no exception. But also cognizant of the fact that unless we understand the effect that cities and the built environment have on societies and vice versa, the urban dividend will not be distributed equitably across cities. So, I mean, at least across citizens or residents of a city. In South Africa and Joburg in particular, it's particularly important given the effect of apartheid on our urban form. And it's one of the lasting legacies of apartheid that's taking quite a while to deal with. And I think underestimate the effect of the built environment on the human potential and the development of that human potential. So my particular area of interest is a focus on those built environment interventions that mitigate mitigate the negative impacts of undesirable environments and enhance kind of the physical environment as part of kind of realizing human potential.
That is beautiful. That is a great thesis right there. If anyone's listening. So, can you tell us about some of the projects that you have worked on in South Africa?
The probably two that stick out. So the one was quite a few years back. It was called the National Urban Renewal Program. It was a national program in 8 cities, and it was really focusing on driving economic development in townships. So 8 of the country, maybe not the biggest, but so Khayelitsha in Cape Town, Alexandra in Johannesburg, and Danzani in East London, and really looking at how we start increasing the economic performance of those spaces so that they stop functioning as dormitory towns, and also strengthening the connections between the townships and the town centers. I worked on that for about 4 years, I think, 4 or 5 years, I think. And then my more recent experiences with the city of Joburg, a program we call the Corridors of Freedom, again, built on exactly the same concept, understand the spatial implications of these dormitory towns, and through planning policy, infrastructure investment, incentives and disincentives for the private sector, how do we start stitching the city together, literally, but also kind of looking at where the city is investing its budget and what the return on investment on that is, and not just in financial returns, but trying to track the social returns as well.
And when you refer to stitching the city together, are you referring to as healing or just making sure that everyone is more connected?
So the kind of above the line, more tangible expression of that stitching is in the physical sense. So looking at the public transport, looking at densifying along those public transport routes, and also increasing the residential carrying capacity of the parts of the city that have high job density. So when we did the mapping of the city, we saw that there are very few parts of the city that have both a high job density and a high population density. So there was this disconnect between where people live and where they work. So part of the stitching was to pull those elements together to reduce the requirement, the mobility requirement. So that's the one. But the kind of social stitching was being deliberate in being inclusionary, in where we're locating public housing,
right?
And a lot more kind of explicit around social reengineering, because apartheid was social engineering. So if we're gonna reverse that, we have to be a lot bolder than what we had been. So there's the kind of 2 elements to it. One was the kind of physical environment. The other is the social element to it. And we did use kind of infrastructure. So we looked at where social infrastructure, where clinics, schools, and parks were, and how we start opening up access to those facilities, a wider range of users, as spaces where social cohesion and mix could happen.
I know a lot of us are not as well. We are very aware of what has happened in South Africa, but we don't know the extent of the history there. So there's a few questions you might have seen that really kind of, have us asking a little bit about the history. So hopefully we'll get a chance to, get some of those out of the way. So moving on, because we have so many great questions and a lot of amazing knowledge to receive. So Brandon has lived in South Africa, as I said, for 2 years, and Chris has had some experience in South Africa also. And as I've alluded to, most of us haven't been to South Africa, and we're not quite sure what the climate is like in current Johannesburg. So can you tell us about what the political situation is like in Johannesburg, climate, attitudes, ethnicities, and even some infrastructure in the small time frame we have?
Okay, so just to give you rattle a few numbers, right? So Joburg is in the smallest province in the country, but it contributes, the province contributes about 40% of the national GDP, and Joburg contributes 15% of the national GDP. So we're the economic powerhouse. In fact, until recently, the performing city in terms of contributing to the national economy. Population size of about 5.5 million people. And over 40% of the city's residents are migrants from other parts of South Africa, but also from other parts of the continent. So there's a constant threat of xenophobia. And these kind of ethnic mix. In fact, there's one going on now against Somali nationals. There's still, it's very, very cosmopolitan. So if you go to restaurants and so on, you will see a mix. So now you're starting to see a greater racial mix, but the class mix is still very distinct. So it's very obvious when you're in a poor part of the city, similarly when you're in a wealthy part of the city. Since August 2016, the kind of ANC is no longer in Johannesburg. Joburg is being run through a political coalition between Democratic Alliance and a few other small parties. And the kingmaker is Economic Freedom Fighters. I don't know if you guys have heard of Julius Malema.
Yes.
Do a favor and listen to
Amandla.
There you go, Brandon. There you go. And it's the first time that South African government has had to deal with coalition politics, as in first time since the local government elections in August. So the political administration is evolving, and quite frankly, I think it's being faced by challenges that we don't necessarily have the skill and ability to comprehend. So to give you an example, the EFF is the kingmaker. So without the EFF at council, the Democratic Alliance would not be able to pass a motion or get something approved. But they haven't formed government, so they're not part of government. So they influence the decisions that the governing party makes without any direct political accountability. And that's an interesting twist on democracy, because suddenly the people who are making decisions, or at least influencing the decisions, are not themselves in the executive and running the system.
Okay.
So from a governance point of view, the interesting shifts that are happening, and like I said, I think the biggest shock to the system is the whole idea of coalition politics. In particular, when the coalition parties are from different ideological positions. Yeah, I mean the EFF is the extreme left and DA is liberal. So between nationalizing banks and expropriating land without compensation, which is the EFF view on the world, to the DA, which is pro-market, kind of free market aligned. So there are interesting tensions in that regard. The political mood, at least from a citizen's point of view, a resident's point of view, is a little bit difficult to read, because if you follow any of the politicians on Twitter, there are as many who are pro as who are against. The one thing that the current mayor has been about is anti-corruption. And we've had like such bad corruption that everyone, just on that alone, he's getting a lot of support. But he has Trump-like tendencies. So there's a big thing now about how porous the borders are and the proportion of non-South Africans that are in Johannesburg. And his big thing is about being clear on who's a South African, who's a non-South African, and people who are in the city illegally should go back to wherever it is that they come from. So there is that element that's a little bit worrying. And there have been concerns that that stance is actually fueling the xenophobic attacks. So that's a 2-minute kind of spin.
Thank you. That is a nice teaser. So now we'll all go and buy like a bunch of books and read.
Spend a lot of time on YouTube and just check out Julius Malema and follow him on Twitter.
Will do.
His speeches are nice.
Right? Yeah.
So we have a question also about tribal affiliations, and does it have any representation in community engagement and in government?
Tribal representation.
Yeah.
So it is a factor, but it's a greater factor in national politics and national government and in provincial government, and less so in a city. As I said, Joburg is very, very cosmopolitan, and it's a migrant city, so people have kind of married and intermarried. So it's kind of difficult to draw those distinctions. But having said that, we as South Africans, we're very conscious of our tribal lines. So I'm Xhosa, and generally if I come across another Xhosa speaking person, there's an automatic friendship or alliance that happens. But I think that those tribal lines are not at least to the extent that they play themselves out in who gets into political office or gets into administrative office. They're not as clear in a city as they are, I would say, in national departments.
Okay.
And provinces generally tend to be, those delineation tend to be along tribal lines. So KZ, KwaZulu-Natal is where the Zulus are, the Eastern Cape is where the Xhosas are, you know, so it kind of plays itself that way at that level of government.
Gotcha. No, that answers that. Thank you. We appreciate it. So we're going to go into planning and development in some historical context. So how is planning viewed by the public today, and has South Africa's history, the apartheid of course, created a distrust for planning effort or of the planning officials?
So I think that there's great awareness of the importance and value of planning in getting us beyond our past into the future. In fact, at a time, there was a distinct focus on trying to increase the number of students who get into the planning field. And there's been deliberate thought on planning practice and the planning curriculum. So to be quite clear on what it is that the planning professionals ought to be dealing with as an antithesis to apartheid. So if that was about division, foregrounding, inclusion, and so on in planning curriculum and then in planning practice. Similarly with planning law, there have been quite a successive pieces of national legislation to kind of guide what ought to be happening in planning. The most recent one came into effect in 2013, I think, the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, which is quite deliberate about driving an inclusionary kind of spatial inclusion as a key driver. Even in national policy documents, the kind of lasting effect on South African cities is flagged as being one of the key challenges that we need to deal with. So as a discipline and what the discipline ought to be addressing, I think there's the right focus. I do think, however, that whether it comes from practice or from teaching, that we don't necessarily have the right skills as tools to tackle the challenges head on. So the hope that had been placed on planning, I think, has not realized for many South Africans, because the 23, 24 years later, we actually still have the same settlement patterns, if not worse. Some of the programs, the post-democracy programs around housing provision, for instance, have exacerbated this dislocation between where poor people live and where they work. So I think there is a bit of a letdown, I guess, by the planning profession. The other thing is, because there's such disparities in understanding, in language and skill in communities, many times when you are discussing a planning concept with the kind of poorer parts of the city, people don't understand, so people don't engage with it. People are hardly engaged on a planning policy, but they'll come to a meeting to discuss a housing product because that's a lot more tangible and understandable. And I think as planning professionals, we haven't developed the skills and language to engage with the variety of levels of understanding that a typical city or local government.
Okay. Thank you. That definitely gives us a great insight into planning in South Africa. And also helps us, think about certain things here in the United States and where our shortcomings are. So can you tell us, so we know that urbanization in South Africa is growing, and is more urban growth in South Africa sustainable? If so, and if not, what could be done to make urbanization more sustainable?
Okay, we'll come back to what you mean by sustainable, but let's park that for a minute. So the urbanization is definitely a force. I think we're sitting at about 66% of the population being urbanized. Okay. But there've been some interesting trends. So obviously the metros, the big cities are growing, but there's an emergence of secondary cities. and rural areas that by location, infrastructure are rural, but the population densities are very high. So you wouldn't ordinarily classify them as urban, but if you look at population density, they're actually urban. There's a national initiative or policy, integrated urban development framework that tries to understand and categorize different levels and types of urbanization and develop interventions that are fit for purpose, so that you don't treat the major cities the same way that you would do secondary cities. So you ask if it is sustainable. I think by and large not. Some of the major reasons is firstly the extent of urban sprawl. So our population densities are actually very low. So Joburg's density is probably at 3,000 people per square kilometer. And it's the distribution of density. I mean, it's really skewed. So a place like Alexandra, which is a township in Johannesburg, is 42,000 people per square kilometer, but it's a very poor area. Suburban Johannesburg is probably about 600-700 people per square kilometer. So how the urban form is organized and the overlay of density and opportunity in that is very unsustainable. And because of sprawl, our per capita infrastructure costs are very high. So yeah, Joburg is 1,665 square kilometers in size with a population of 5.5 million. So that is the one issue. The other issue relates to so if we take the environmental angle to sustainability, there are parts of the city that are occupied that are very sensitive and prone to flooding. We've had instances in the last 2-3 years of flash floods that have literally converted streets into rivers, and cars have been swept off those. And that's purely from a stormwater management point of view. We have some riverbanks that are occupied within the flood line, and the extent of development and sprawl is actually compromising some of the kind of ecological assets in the city. So, and not just from poor people, not just from land invasions, but some of the estates are kind of exclusive estates that are being developed on wetlands or in ecologically sensitive areas. So there are definite risks in that regard.
Right.
And then and similarly from an economic point of view, there's a huge disconnect in terms of the income distribution in the city. I think the average white person earns 11 times what the average black person earns. So, and that's clearly not sustainable. The level of youth unemployment, we have a significant youth population. Youth unemployment is at about 50%. So if you look at this even from a kind of demographic profile and access to opportunity, there are huge disconnects in that regard.
Those are some shocking stats. Oh my goodness. Okay. So,
but it's not all bad. So I mustn't speak as if everything is like horrible and negative.
We have similar issues here, so we really do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk a little bit about land ownership, because we know that's been in the news quite a bit. Yep. And given that land ownership is an incredibly hot topic in South Africa, EF's political party leader, as you had told us, Julius, has brought this to the forefront, and the ANC has recently promised land expropriation without compensation, as you have told us. How will this affect town planning efforts in the future? And what are some ways that South Africa has tried to mitigate or reconcile its town planning past?
So I'm inclined to answer this as Yondela, not on behalf of South Africa or South Africans. Yeah.
Understood. We got.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, so there definitely is an issue around ownership patterns. I don't know what the numbers are off the top of my head, but there was a land audit that was done recently to kind of try and see what the land ownership profile is like. Yeah, I think so there was a time when it was 13% of the land was owned by Black people and the balance was owned by white people. But I think that number has shifted a little bit, but not sufficiently to kind of change that profile significantly. The biggest land distribution initiative has been the provision of public housing. So when the housing subsidy started, one of the decisions that was made is that it was going to be premised on ownership. So there would be transfer of ownership to Black people, for Black people in particular. That way they would be able to leverage of land as an asset and build a wealth base and break the kind of intergenerational poverty trap. That has performed I don't think it's performed optimally from a wealth creation point of view, but certainly in terms of transferring ownership to land. Part of the problem is that the land is poorly located, but at least people do own land. And just on the land expropriation issue, so the EFF's proposition is that all land in South Africa should be owned by the state, and everybody will be a tenant of the state. The ANC is kind of maybe not quite, and they've put a caveat that says that's fine, provided that you don't disrupt food production or impact on the economy. My sense is that as urban practitioners, we're missing an opportunity of rethinking not land ownership just in relation to the bare dominium, but how we deal with property rights and land use rights. So if you look at most South American cities, your ownership of the land versus your ownership or entitlement to the economic benefit that comes from the land is disconnected. So it's possible, for instance, in Sao Paulo and those places to have the CPACs and where you can trade FSI independently of the ownership of the land. In South African law, your right to the economic benefit is inalienable from your ownership of the land. And I think this discussion from an urban perspective, it would have been an interesting way, if not change the ownership of the land, but give the state some freedom to play around with the economic. That way you could distribute land use rights across the city. You could be a lot bolder in instruments like inclusionary zoning, for instance, because a person is not entitled to the land use rights. So the conditions that the state imposes to drive a socioeconomic inclusion agenda would progress a little bit further. So I don't know if land expropriation without compensation is ever going to materialize as the EFF envisages. I suspect this thing is going to drag for a while, but I think it presents an opportunity to rethink how we administer urban land, right through to what it takes to register property when people sell to each other. So one of the problems, for instance, is that a lot of the free state housing that people took transfer of, they're selling to each other totally outside of the legal system. So the national registry, that record does not have the most up-to-date record of who owns what in that segment of the market. And that's because of kind of regulatory hurdles that are unreasonable for low-income homes.
Wow, okay. Well, I have taken up the first half of this interview, and now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Brandon, and he will take over the helm for the second half.
Sure. No, it's nice speaking with you. I have so many personal questions now, just with, okay, but we're gonna,
Okay.
Let's start with where did you stay when you're in Joburg, and let's see how far I am from your hood.
Oh, okay, yeah. I was in Sapphire Town next to Westbury, right by UJ Kingsway.
Oh, but I'm at Vets now, so I'm spitting distance from.
Oh, neighbors.
Did you see the Westbury? Did you see the Westbury protest in the last 2 weeks?
No.
There's colored communities, and it started in Westbury, declared a shutdown because they feel like there's not sufficient attention being given to their issues, and that the state is not dealing with gang violence and drugs and stuff like that in those areas. So they burnt the BRT station outside Westbury.
Oh my goodness.
It's been hectic. Yeah. But anyway, back to your questions.
Oh man, there was always stuff going on there. There was, fees must fall. Like I got tear gas. It was a lot. But okay, so because I worked at UJ, so I was on campus a lot. So that's a whole other. Okay. So I'm thinking of everything you said, and most of us Americans don't. So I'm gonna try to bridge a gap people may have with. I'm looking at these questions. So in South Africa, okay, so before I came to South Africa, I thought it was maybe like half white or a majority white. This country is only 8% white. It's also 8% colored, which is about mixed race, and then 3% Indian. So, and then when we talk about, when you say township, she's saying, well, can you explain the difference between the city center, the township, and where the colored communities live, like the buffers in between, so people can understand what that is and how informal settlements are the uh, squatter camps inside the township, like those smaller. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so typically the city center will be high-rise buildings, predominantly office, some residential, and retail. Around that, you would generally have kind of suburban Johannesburg, and these are high-income homes, traditionally single dwelling unit, single family dwelling unit. Increasingly, though, a lot more apartment buildings. So Joburg is what, the second largest urban jungle. So these are tree-lined avenues, private swimming pools, private tennis courts. You would not think you're in Africa, whatever your conception of Africa is, but it looks nothing like what you would think Africa is. Probably 20 or so kilometers away from the city center, so 15 to 20 kilometers away, you will find what we call townships. And these are, so suburban Johannesburg is typically white. So 20 odd kilometers away from the city center, you will find townships. These are matchbox type houses. So one house looks exactly like the next one. Predominantly black, low income, but increasingly middle to low income. And the spaces in between would have pockets of so-called either colored or Indian areas. So if you think about it, the kind of order of being human was white, Indian, colored, black. And the urban form reflects that. So white is in the middle, colored and Indian in between, and black is in the back of beyond. And shacks or slums they vary. So now we have slums even in the center of towns, in the CBDs, in hijacked buildings, and people kind of divide that in industrial areas. People have taken over factories and converted those into slums, but the bulk of them are generally on the periphery of the city. So the poorest people live the furthest from employment, and we don't have very good public transport. So, and the minibus taxi is the biggest kind of mode of getting around the city.
Gotcha. No, that's perfect. You answered you answered like a number of questions. I'm trying to look at so we had some readings tied to waste collection. So I'm gonna read one of these. Oh, there's a lot. Okay. Okay, so we've read about the informal role of waste collectors collecting recyclables. There was a recent study speaking about recognizing this sector by offering trainings. However, this study didn't mention financial compensation. Many of these workers, one day of work is only enough money to support themselves or their family for one day. Has there been any new information or developments about solid waste management in Johannesburg and its relationship with the waste collectors?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know about new developments, but let me just go back a little, and just in terms of how the waste management works. So household waste is collected generally once a week. We've got 240 liter bins that you wheel out once a week, and the truck comes around. In unserviced areas or in the slums, there generally isn't regular waste collection, but people will dump. There's a lot of illegal dumping. And the city would then occasionally go and clean up those areas. There are a few building material sites or disposal sites where you're supposed to take your building material, but and there you buy weight, and for a lot of households that's very expensive. So again, there's a lot of illegal dumping of building material. Probably about 5 or so years back, the city started a program waste sorting at source. So where weight separation at source, where households are encouraged to separate their waste and take it out either in different bags or take it out on different days. At the same time, the recycling economy had picked up, and all of these buyback centers had been created, and a lot of unemployed people were able to sell or material for recycling. But because it's difficult for them to get to the waste disposal sites to collect from there, they started collecting from households. So when you wheel your bin out, they're the guys who come. It's amazing. I mean, the size of these are makeshift trailers that they've created, and they go around the suburb. So in my area, we take our bins out on a Wednesday. So from about 5 a.m. in the morning, these guys are out and they sort your waste. If you haven't sorted, they take the stuff that they want to take. Depending on the suburb, they're usually very good in putting the waste back in the bin. But what they do is that they take whatever. Yeah, so it does depend on the suburb where you are. But what they do is that they take whatever they've collected and they'll go in a felt or somewhere and unbundle everything that they've collected and then sort it properly. And whatever they don't use, they live there. So along river banks, in many parks, anything that's kind of accessible but hidden, there's a lot of waste that's been happening, or the dumping that's been happening. So whatever is left over that they cannot sell from what they had collected. So the city had started a program to support the waste pickers, the recycling guys, to try and create the sorting centers. So they must wheel their stuff to the sorting center, and whatever they don't use from there can be dismantled. I don't know for certain what has happened with that, but what I've observed is that the litter in this area, in these informal sorting areas, is increasing. I think the city is not rolling out the sorting centers fast enough or close enough to where the guys need to sort. But there's also another interesting thing. So all of the cycling infrastructure that had been created, the NMT infrastructure, the guys are using as their own lane when they're transporting their waste on. So you don't see many cyclists, but you see the waste pickers riding their trolleys on this. Yeah. And those things are scary because I don't think they're always in control. And sometimes these things veer off those lanes like crazy. So it is an issue, but there's a definite drive on separation at source for households. And the current mayor started a program where citizens are encouraged, or residents are encouraged, to come out once a month and clean up the area to try and kind of contain the extent of illegal dumping.
No, that's awesome. I think we have 15 minutes. Going through all of these. Okay, what's another one? Okay, yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk about Mabaning. That was like one of my favorite places to chill. Chillas, in Mabaning. A little expensive though. But okay, so despite various attempts to counter the negative processes associated with gentrification in the Mabaning precinct, it appears as though the people from the surrounding Jeffreystown community are physically, socially, and economically excluded from the area. What does mixed income housing look like in such an economic polarized environment along racial and spatial lines? And for example, Mabaning or just the CBD urban core.
So firstly, I totally agree with the problem statement around the exclusion of people in the surrounding areas. In Mabaning, there were quite a few evictions when they started because in some instances they took over buildings that had been hijacked. And I don't know that all of those people were moved into decent alternative accommodation. What the city is doing now is running a process of releasing buildings that it owns for provision of social housing. So this is housing that's aimed at households earning between 1,500 and 15,000 rands a month. You can convert that to dollars. And the city using its own assets in partnership with the private sector to provide those opportunities. And there does seem to be quite a great deal of interest in the market. And I think that the proportion of affordable housing in the CBD at least is likely to increase in the next 3 years or so.
Gotcha. No.
So that deals with housing. What I think might be a secondary issue is places like Maboneng are not manufacturing areas. In fact, Maboneng in particular is displacing manufacturing space in Joburg, which has a high labor absorption capacity, in particular for low-skill labor. And it's replacing it with a services industry, which also in terms of restaurants and so on, has some labor absorptive capacity, but I don't know that it matches the opportunity. I don't know that people who are displaced when the economy is moved are able to be absorbed in the economic opportunities that are presented in Maboneng. So I think it is something that the city needs to take a closer look at and not solve only the housing disconnection or dislocation problem, but also the economic one.
No. That answers a lot. That answers a lot, and we can definitely relate to gentrification. This happening in the U.S. I'm trying to think. Okay, so how many minutes? Okay, 2 minutes. And you talked about this. Okay, so what initiatives and strategies are being used moving forward to ensure that gentrification projects to do not intentionally marginalize the group of people, one specific group over other people? So I know there was one project said there was, I think, like 400 units going up of affordable housing in, I think, Braamfontein, or it was in Maboneng, but just more. Are there any new strategies as far as not displacing people?
Sure. So the two big ones is the one I mentioned earlier on, where the city is releasing its own real estate stock that's underutilized for use for affordable housing. The other is inclusionary zoning. So the city now, as part of its planning policy, is testing the idea of imposing as a condition of approval a 20% affordable housing yield for any housing residential development. That way you kind of force the inclusion as a condition of land use rights.
Gotcha. And we just got a question from Professor Chris. How well the encouragement of monthly community service has worked in Joburg. He's talking about a mixed result that happened in Rwanda, and was it mandatory or well, you can talk about it.
So it is modeled, as I just saw his note, it is modeled after the Rwandan example. It's totally optional, it's not mandatory. It's had varied success in suburban Johannesburg. It's gone fairly well, and I think the reason for that is totally political. So it's driven by a DA mayor whose constituency is suburban Johannesburg. Yeah. In the townships, which are still predominantly kind of the previous party's domain, it hasn't received as much support. There's also been complaints that this government is not particularly pro-poor, that the level of waste collection in townships, for instance, has decreased since the new mayor came in. So there is mixed views on how successful it's been, but it's been continuing for a while now.
Okay. Now I'm looking at. So here's another question. So do you ever face situations where your vision for sustainable growth and development do not match others, or that people are more focused on the short term versus the long term vision? How have you handled this or worked with others to create a vision that's more lasting?
So I mean, it is stock standard that those approaches those visions are not likely to be shared in common from the get-go. So if you take developers, for instance, in particular real estate developers that are just developers, so they're interested in the short-term development profit. But if you talk to typically real estate funds who hold assets over a period, they tend to take a much longer view. So one of the things we learn to do is to understand who the different players are and what their range is, and have real estate investment discussions a lot more with the real estate funds and asset managers who hold assets over time than to talk to developers who do the short-term kind of conversion from vacant land to developed land, because otherwise the kind of planning horizons that we look at are totally mismatched, and you can't expect if it takes a 3-year view to account for 20-year costs, operational costs, for instance. And similarly with politicians, that they're in office for 5 years and they would want to conceptualize an idea that can be executed and delivered within a 5-year period. And most of the planning policy and stuff in the built environment has a much longer kind of runway, much longer than 5 years. So they're the kind of things that we learned to do as an administration, is to incubate some programs a lot longer. So incubate them almost outside of the kind of political realm. And when it matures and it's able to show tangible dividends, then you can take it into politics, because it does present opportunities for ribbon cutting and all those things. But if you're not deliberate in understanding that some of these things that take time, to put them to politicians where you know that you're not going to deliver them within a 5-year period would be silly. And similarly with kind of residents associations, I mean, one of the kind of long-running battles that we've been having around densification and inclusion is that suburban Johannesburg is not keen on that, because what they know is kind of the streamlined single household residential units. But once you start talking to people kind of outside of their immediate environment, and you talk to people about what they've seen when they've traveled outside of South Africa, they understand what it is that we're trying to go through. And then just be gentle and understand that you're managing a transition. So be gentle and almost like be a midwife in the birthing of this transition. And you can't force it. You just have to kind of hold it until it happens. So yeah.
No, that's great. No, that's
you're having images of a midwife, and that's disturbing. Sorry.
no, it's real. I mean, South Africa is going through a lot of transitions in every way. So no, that was a perfect connection. I'm looking at another question. So Cape Town just recently narrowly avoided day zero water shortages, but the water crisis isn't over yet. And there seems to be a spreading concern in South Africa, including the Gauteng province. Do you have any ideas on whether Joburg is likely headed towards a similar crisis? Are there any planning efforts or other efforts that are trying to head off such an extreme shortage?
So our day zero in Johannesburg was meant to be 2014. And a number of drivers for that. So one was acid mine drainage. So there's a lot of groundwater that comes from mining, and there's there's contamination of our groundwater. And the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, where we're getting the bulk of the water, that wasn't coming on stream fast enough. So all projections were that we were going to hit day zero in 2014.
Oh wow! I didn't know that.
The city had driven a few kind of demand side interventions. So they're doing things like installing low flush toilets, so to reduce the amount of water that's used. You'll find now in most public buildings that I don't know what you call it, the technology where the tap doesn't run forever. So when you're washing your hands, it runs only for so much. So there have been quite a few demand side interventions that have been introduced. There's a time when we had I don't know what there was a water shortage, so there were limitations on what you could do with municipal water, and we're seeing a lot more people harvesting rainwater, for irrigation and so on, and not using kind of premium grade municipal water for irrigation, and greater use of grey water within the home.
Gotcha. No, perfect. We have a question from Chris. Could you say more about the role of the private sector in development in Joburg? Are they the primary developers for residential and commercial lands? And where does the capital for such development come from?
So we have a very strong and active they've organized themselves into an entity called the South African Property Owners Association, SAPOA, that acts as a lobby group for policy change and just to kind of keep the state on its toes. They are the biggest real estate investor in commercial, office, retail, and residential. But I'm trying to think about, because even with private home build, the land preparation is still done by a developer, and in SAPOA, there's an interesting mix between developers who do the initial land preparation in the building, and then they typically will on sale onto real estate funds who hold the assets for a longer period. We've got a very strong kind of listed property is a very big part of the Joburg Stock Exchange.
Mm.
What we've seen in the last few years, though, is quite a few of the real estate funds are taking the money outside South Africa.
Okay.
The last time I looked, I think something like 35% of the funds are invested outside South Africa. And that's an indicator of diminishing faith in the body politics of the country.
Mm. I have a personal question about that, but Ramaphosa. But okay, so another question on here. Um, what transportation solutions do you foresee South Africa exploring in the next 20 years to address their transportation needs? Will they use innovative approaches like bus rapid transit, or continue to rely on roads and I get roads, car, bike, and I guess minibus travel is what the question's saying.
Yeah. So I think if we take a 20-year view in solving, in addressing the transportation issue, we must start with the urban form and a greater tolerance for mixed use areas to reduce the need to travel in the first instance. So our cities remain very, very monofunctional. So even in terms of suburbs, less so within a property, as in within an earth or a plot, less so within a building. So we're trying to move to get a greater mix even within a building, but there's some cultural kind of resistance to that. BRT is no longer seen as being a new technology. Joburg has had BRT since 2009, just before the World Cup.
Yeah.
In fact, the city is now toying around with some of the kind of more innovative things like autonomous vehicles, and seeing what impact those will have. We had a session with the city, and we're trying to understand mobility as a service and what it takes for the Transport Authority in Joburg to be a mobility as a service institution and aggregate a whole range of transportation solutions, even if they're not owned by the state, but aggregated and matching supply and demand, and that being the role of the city. There's a huge emphasis on rail. So Gautrain is planning Gautrain 2 and expanding. Yeah, so they've kind of done the planning work in looking at where the stations are going to be. They're busy with the financial modeling now to see how they will finance it. I think it's 111 billion rands capital outlay that's required between now and 2037, I think, is the planning horizon. And yeah, I think there's some questions being asked about whether BRT is the right solution. Because it's not an integrated public transport system, so other modes of public transport are not able to use the infrastructure. So increasingly, there's a question being asked about whether or not this is in fact the right solution. And again, and then just finally, there's a lot of emphasis on non-motorized infrastructure. So increasing pavement size to enable people to walk and cycle and all of those.
Man, I have another question. But we have, okay, so it's 9:16. I'm going to say, okay, yeah. So what do you think, what do you see for the future of South Africa? And what challenges do you face that could affect the future of South Africa? Yeah.
I see beautiful sunsets and rainbows. So I think that one of the challenges we have is a mistrust of government. Okay. And an erosion of governance and government. So there isn't a clear leader of society either in politics or in government, and I think that's for a country that's still kind of struggling to think of itself as a single nation, to not have a clear leader of society, I think is problematic, and I worry that there aren't enough institutions and people who are kind of imagining what we need to do and putting in place the right policies and legislation to take us there. So that the governance thing is a real concern, and across different spheres and levels of government. The other is inequality, in particular when it comes to young people. There's a growing, but the disillusionment is playing itself out in violent protests, in young people lashing out, in predisposition to drug abuse. So this youth dividend is we're not getting the benefit of the youth dividend, and I think inequality is a big part of that. So for me, those are possibly the two greatest threats. But there's an indomitable spirit, if that's a word, in South Africans, and I think even with all of those challenges, we will still be the rainbow nation. I think we'll pull through, but it will be with great difficulty and suffering.
Mm. No, that's great to hear. I guess I just want to say from the class, we're thankful for you coming to speak to us. Siyabonga, Hamagashe.
Well done, Engos.
We want to hand it to Chris. Do you have anything to say or?
Well, this has been really spectacular. I'm sort of, I've only spent a little bit of time in Johannesburg, and I found it a completely compelling city for all the reasons you mentioned. It's not a smoothly functioning city where everything just operates like it's, a Swiss watch, but that's part of what makes it compelling. It's such a dynamic place that, I would love to have a 8-hour discussion with you, but I won't torture you with that.
Over a beer for sure.
Yes, over a beer for sure. Do you have questions for us or anything? We fired all these questions at you. Is there anything you'd like to ask of us? We have an assembled group of, experts here, and also people who have been talking to people like you from around the world.
Sure. So the one thing would be having read up on South Africa, and for some of you having been here, are there any blind spots that we are missing? So things that we ought to be tackling more directly that we're perhaps not paying attention to, and seen from a city government perspective.
That's a good question.
That is.
So we have a participant in this call today, Devon Woodard, who's a PhD student in planning, governance, and globalization, who hopes to come to Johannesburg, who does a lot of work on urban analytics, urban computing. Are you still on, Devon? It would be interesting to see what he has to say about kind of the role of analytics, and maybe you have something to say about that as well, Yondela. I'm talking primarily about big data, things of that sort.
I think he's gone.
Is he gone? That's too bad. That's too bad. So others, what do you think? What can you suggest, or what would you like to know more about in the context of what Yondela is asking?
Man, I'm trying to think. But everything you said is, I don't think people in this group know how much Joburg is a world-class, African city. Like it is. I was taking the How train to Pretoria every time I went. It's a subway system. I didn't even know they were trying to do a part 2 of the series. There's a Ria Vaya. They built that for the World Cup. So it's basically the bus system up and down Empire and then go straight to Soweto. Man, I don't know. Is anything that's you guys are missing that you may not see?
Well, how much, Yondela, I have a question. Is how much pressure do you have to provide development that richer people, whites, but also richer, more wealthy Black South Africans and colored South Africans want, at the expense of providing resources to underinvested in communities? Because as you well know, the Gautrain itself is a fixed rail, is serving kind of an exclusive set of suburbs. And an autonomous train, which has a lot of kind of sexy appeal, obviously doesn't help in a labor situation, where people need jobs. Do you have thoughts on that? Or first off, do you have pressures to kind of balance those two? And then second is, labor in providing decent jobs to people is such an enormous challenge that all of South Africa and places such as Joburg face. Yeah. How do you navigate that terrain?
So the biggest pressure point in relation to the wealthy Joburgers and the poor Joburgers is less in the provision of the capital asset, more in the maintenance. Mm-hmm. So middle income Joburgers can buy the properties of the market, so that market is well functioning. It's how the city is able to maintain the infrastructure, traffic lights, potholes, and that kind of thing. So that's where the pressure is. And the city deciding between patching a pothole in Sandton or tarring a road in Soweto. And there's an interesting trend that's happening now with social media, those kind of middle income to high income areas can get the city to respond just by starting a Twitter trend. And you can speak to the mayor, you can speak to heads of departments on Twitter, and the low income areas, they don't have access to power and decision makers as easily. So they tend to have service delivery protests and burn stuff. So we often used to talk about the Twitterati and the burnerati. And it says a lot about the kind of inequitable access to power, even, and the ability to influence and to activate state response. So that definitely is an issue. With regards to things like public transport, so because of the reliance on private cars, the middle to high income aren't complaining as much because they can pretty much sort out their transportation requirements.
Right.
So the Gautrain and the fact that it does serve an elite, that is a big issue with practitioners who look at what the subsidy regime looks like, and the fact that the minibus taxi is probably the single biggest public transport move of people without any subsidies at all. And yet the Gautrain, and which by design is actually, because it's not intended to be an everyday commuter system. I mean, you have individual seats, and you're not allowed to chew gum or drink water
Or eat.
Yeah, or breathe
I broke
heavily.
that a lot.
Breathe.
So, but because because the middle to high income clientele uses cars to get around, they're not as bothered by the state of the public rail or PRASA trains, for instance, or the Rea Vaya. So those contestations don't play themselves out, I think, as much as they would in an area where you had a lot more people using public transport.
Right.
But that contest between, and it's real, right? So because it also does, if you look at the city's revenue and you look at where the city makes money from rates and taxes, it does come from the high income areas. So that is the goose that lays the golden egg, and you have to respond to it, you have to service it, because otherwise the city coffers would dry up.
Yes, it's no different. It's no different than it is here in America, particularly with that example of public transit and the higher speed fixed rail is going to the wealthier suburbs first. Even in Washington, D.C., Anacostia, which is a historically black area in Washington, D.C., was the last area to get Metro Rail.
Yeah, I mean, the one other area where there is actually contestation, it relates to public safety and the gated communities. So the city is fighting a losing battle pretty much in trying to not approve gated these closed estates. But the counter to that, or the proponents of that, relate to crime, and it's very difficult to say no because crime is a real issue. So and all of those things kind of impact on the urban functionality of Joburg. So you have these enclaves, and the city is not as permeable as it could be because of these gated areas. And now you're starting to see them in middle to low income areas as well.
Wow.
Really wish we could continue this conversation. Oh my gosh.
Yes.
It's brought up more questions as we're going along.
The similarities to America are crazy. Like, I'm just thinking of all I was surprised when I went over there. I'm like, wow, we have the same issue. But it's flipped because here, the population is, like I'm in Anacostia right now in the Southeast. So, I mean, that's just like what he was talking about in DC. So,
yeah, it is that inversion they're so similar, and that inversion makes it so different too.
Yeah, the scale just blows your mind.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and as much as maldistribution of wealth as we have here in the States, in South Africa, it's